Okay, good afternoon, Dad.
Good afternoon.
Today is Friday, March 21st. And let me start you with a kind of a broader question. What do you think right now is the major obstacle for peace between Ukraine and Russia right now? What's holding things up?
Well, I think the major obstacle is the Kiev regime. They actually haven't budged. They did agree to this ceasefire. After I think clearly a lot of arm twisting, and I think they agreed to it knowing that the Russians wouldn't agree to it. So I don't think that was very significant. I don't think it was really a step in the direction of peace on their part, or any kind of compromise for that matter. Um, they haven't budged. There was some hope that maybe, they were starting to recognize reality. But after that meeting in Jeddah, we started to hear all the same statements. Everything is ours. We have to get it all back. Crimea. Maybe we can wait a little longer on Crimea. We got to get that back. We're going to be part of NATO. It's just everything that the Russians made clear, is completely unacceptable to them. So, and yeah, it's a regime that really, again, as I've said many times, is under the control of violent ideologues, and that they're ready to fight to the very end. So I won't say it doesn't matter what the U.S. and Russia does, whether or not they actually have successful negotiations. That does matter. It could bring a speedier end to the war if that in fact, or those negotiations in fact succeed. But Kiev will always be the spoiler. Even if there is a negotiated settlement, they're going to keep on fighting. And the enablers of the spoiler, of course, are the Europeans. They have made it clear that, they're not in favor of negotiations and of any real settlement, that any ceasefire that could be lasting. They are still in favor of war, and they just back the Kiev regime to the hilt. So I would say that that's the major obstacle, Kiev and its
Well,
enablers.
well, if the EU's the enabler, but we've said before that they don't really have many cards to play. So how are they enabling the Kiev regime? Can the US force a regime change or I mean, or we've talked about this. If they just deprive it of military aid and funding, would that force a change of government?
Well, it could potentially. I mean, it would. Um, what it would do would, of course, it would result in a speedier Russian victory. Russia would attain its objectives, whatever they are. There's some debate about how far they want to go, but they would they would attain those objectives, I think, significantly more quickly if the supply of weapons from the U.S. were cut off. With Europe, no, they can't really fill the U.S. shoes. They just can't. They don't have the means, as we said. They can give them something. They can provide funding, so at least like the government can continue to pay salaries and a certain amount of weapons. But it's I don't think they can prevent a collapse on the front. But the thing is, with Kiev, it just seems at this point we haven't seen any signs that they are really willing to surrender, to admit defeat. They're not even close to that, and they seem to be of the mind that they would rather suffer a total defeat than to actually consent to any kind of negotiated settlement. That seems to be their psychology.
Is the U.S. still enabling Ukraine? And if so, to what extent?
Well, oh yes, it most definitely is. Remember, there was that cutoff in military supplies, which was real, but it only lasted a few days. So in the end, it made no difference whatsoever. It was just certain amount of equipment was held in the warehouses in Poland, for a few days, and then they were put on the trains, and the flow continues. Nothing's really changed as far as that goes. And then the talk about the intelligence cutoff, it's just not even clear if there really was an intelligence cutoff, or it certainly wasn't complete. So Yeah, the U.S. is still backing them to the hilt. I don't see any sign. There's talk, and we've said the talk is important, and the talk could indicate changes down the road, but at present, there are no changes.
Well, why is that? I mean, if you say that the Kiev regime is the main obstacle right now because they will not negotiate and they're being backed by the EU saying don't negotiate, keep on fighting. I don't know why, what their goal is to keep fighting for,
Yeah.
but the U.S. says they want to get a negotiated peace settlement, but at the same time, they're still enabling Ukraine.
Yeah.
So do they really want a negotiated peace settlement, or is this just, are they just playing games with us? I don't trust anybody anymore, you know?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I don't really know either. I don't know what's going on in the head of Trump or in in his in his administration in general. Again, we have heard encouraging statements, and there have been, maybe you don't want to call them substantive. We're talking about like votes in the UN and withdrawal from certain very anti-Russian organizations. I think those are all meaningful. I mean, it's more than just an off-the-cuff remark. There have been some, Trump has backed up some of his comments with some, you can say, action, not on the front, not maybe where it really counts, but in the UN, with regard to the NGOs, the kind of the larger, you could say, support apparatus, the propaganda machine, and so on and so forth. Those things do count for something, and he has made some. He has changed direction there. We have to admit it, but nothing has really changed on the ground. There was that temporary suspension, and they really didn't get anything for it. It was this agreement to a temporary ceasefire that I think Kiev probably never expected the Russians to reject. And if the Russians accepted, Kiev probably would not have even abided by it. So I don't know why they resumed the flow of weapons. I think that was a big mistake. So it really is hard to say. We've talked quite a bit about this. Again, there are encouraging signs, but you look at it substantively, very little has happened. Even on the diplomatic front, even in the embassy still haven't been restaffed.
It's a little worrying. Yeah, so there was this, after the Trump-Putin call, there was that talk of this 30-day partial ceasefire where they would cease attacks on each other's energy infrastructure.
Right.
But shortly thereafter, it seemed like Putin wanted to make good on that immediately. You said that they even shot their own drones out of the sky that were on their way to hit some energy infrastructure in Ukraine. And then, a day later, Ukraine pulls off this huge attack on the Suja pipeline. Can you tell us a little bit about that attack?
Yeah, well, I mean, there was an attack just, I think, a few hours after the phone call, or, within 24 hours. That wasn't on Suja. I think that was okay. That was, I believe, the oil pipeline, maybe a pumping station in Krasnodar. That was connected to the Caspian Petroleum Consortium. We mentioned that. Now, that was significant. It happened after the Trump-Putin phone call and the announcement that Putin had agreed to this energy infrastructure ceasefire, but Ukraine went ahead with his attack. But people pointed out and say, well, maybe it doesn't mean anything because Ukraine hasn't agreed to it yet. But then Trump and Putin, or not Trump and Putin, but rather Trump and Zelensky had a phone conversation. And at the end of that, it was reported that Zelensky had agreed to the ceasefire. Yet following that, there was the attack on the Suja metering station that you just mentioned. And that just seems like just a blatant effort to, it's the opposite of, a gesture of goodwill. It was obviously a very malicious gesture, an effort to subvert the ceasefire. And they did it immediately, hours after it was stated that they were going to abide by it. So, yeah, I don't think there's much reason to be hopeful about, the Kiev regime, just as I was saying. I think it's actually a mistake for the Americans. I think maybe the Russians understand this a lot better because they've been burned by the Ukrainians many times in the past, and they just don't trust them anymore. but Trump seems to think that, Ukraine and Russia can somehow achieve some sort of settlement. But it seems to me again that Kiev's making it clear that no, that's just not possible. They're not interested in peace talks. They would rather, I think they'll be lashing out to the end. These kind of attacks that we see, these drone attacks, they have almost no military significance. You can argue that like attacks on energy infrastructure, clearly, potentially could have military significance if they were, very extensive. Like the attacks that Russia's launched against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. It's been devastating. They've lost something like 80% of their electrical capacity. But you don't see anything like that. Again, these are more for show. It's more about, it's about the information war more than the real war. Because they're done by drones. Drones are cheap. You can produce a lot of them. You can send, 100 in one direction, and even if the Russians, shoot down 99 of them, one might get through and hit an oil refining plant and cause a big fire, and there you have your headline. But in the end, the damage that it does to these facilities is relatively superficial. It hasn't had an effect on Russia's economy, and certainly not on, and not even on its really oil production and refining capacity. There's just no sign of it. Oil or gasoline prices are not going up in Russia. Nothing of the sort. They continue to export, I think, increasing amounts around the globe. It's really all for show, these attacks. But Kiev, it's like, it's the only place where they feel like they can win, or maybe, it's in the information warfare arena. We can send some drones out there and we can get some headlines. And, I see the headlines, it's like amazing, devastating attack, but they're clearly not devastating attacks. And I think they want to continue to do these, even as they clearly lose the real war.
It's so clear that the real war is being lost. Why is there so much resistance to peace? Why? I can understand somebody like Zelensky that's in this position where basically, if he doesn't carry this through, the ultranationalists might just kill him, and he's gone this far. Mm-hmm. He's sacrificed so much Ukrainian blood and land, and he feels like he has to have something to show for it. But why is there still so much resistance amongst the Europeans to go for peace? Because, like you say, they don't really have anything to back it up. They're not willing to go in militarily. And even if they do, they're going to get chewed up and spat out. They don't have any industrial capacity. This attack, from what I understand, on the Suja metering pipeline was feeding into Europe, right? So this is attack more on Europe's energy infrastructure more so than it was on Russia. So everything just seems to be self-inflicted, wounds, and no real plan or direction, but just keep going until the whole thing collapses. And it seems clear that that's what's happening. If they don't get a negotiated peace settlement, the whole thing will just collapse on their heads. And maybe maybe they are delusional. I don't know. Maybe that doesn't seem like a satisfying answer, though. I feel like there's got to be what's the plan? What are they working towards?
I don't think they have a plan, to be honest, or their plan is really out there in fantasy land. It's not based on any reality. I would say we've looked at it from different angles. One thing I just will emphasize today is that when you commit to a war, like Zelensky and his government committed to this war, it becomes very difficult to admit defeat because the thing, especially in a way, it's like the more that you suffer, the greater the defeat, the more difficult it becomes to admit it. Because if you finally say, okay, yeah, we made a mistake, we lost this war, you're telling, the parents of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dead soldiers that, okay, yeah, that was my mistake, my bad, that's, and it's something I don't think is. I think it's almost impossible for a political leader to admit that kind of error. So they double down and they keep on saying, okay, yeah, maybe things aren't going so well right now, but there's this wonder weapon that's in the pipeline, we've got this plan. We're gonna strike them. We're going to reverse the outcome on the battlefield, and we'll be marching towards Moscow, or Moscow is actually on the verge of collapse. It's just like the sanctions will finally bite, and the Russian economy will collapse. It's all nonsense, and there's no reason to believe it. They've been saying it, for these things for 3 years. But they have to keep on saying them because, again, the alternative is, oops, a million dead people. Sorry about that. And I just don't, I think it's maybe emotionally and on virtually every level, it's impossible for a leader to admit to something like that. And then it's kind of similar, you can say, within Europe. Obviously the costs aren't nearly as great for these countries. They've lost some young men, mercenaries and so-called mercenaries, people that have been sent over there. But we're talking about at the most hundreds rather than a million or whatever it is in Ukraine. But there has been economic sacrifice. There has been a lot of politicians have, really staked their careers on this, and I think it's part of the same thing. It doesn't explain it entirely. It should be easier for the Europeans to pull out of this because, they've made an emotional commitment, but it's just nothing like what the Ukrainian government has got itself into. So yeah, I think you have to look at this. I think you really do have to talk about some sort of, about delusion, this obsession with moral purity and the sense of them being superior in every way. They really bought into the neocon vision, and now they're, even when their master seems to be turning away from it. They have the zeal of the convert, and again, part of that vision is that no, we are number one. We are the most powerful alliance in the world. So it's just not possible. We really cannot countenance the possibility of a Russian victory. That cannot happen. And so if things are not going well on the battlefield, it must not because, we misjudged our own abilities and we, underestimated the Russians, but rather we just haven't done enough. We just need to double down. And, that's the way they're talking. I mean, it's not like I'm just making this up. That's the way they talk. And they really have said things. I think I quoted, it was the Polish prime minister recently that has said, yeah, we are simply more powerful. It's just an article of faith with them. They're wedded to this ideological vision, and unfortunately, this ideological vision is just entirely divorced from reality, and they're having trouble getting out of it. Or you can explain it a different way. They can help to build this narrative, and they become prisoners of their own narrative. There are a lot of ways to kind of express it, but I would just emphasize that in the case of the Europeans, they just seem to be extraordinarily, delusional.
Are they delusional enough to send troops? Because it keeps on coming up. They keep on talking about sending people into Ukraine, and I'm just wondering, are they one day going to do it?
Yeah. Well, it could happen. They just don't have armies that can really present, a serious threat to Russia or even offer much resistance. I know that, on paper, the British have something like 60,000 combat capable troops, but I think that's an overestimate. When you look at the actual brigades and divisions, they're just they don't have the equipment. So much of that equipment has been sent overseas, or not overseas, but rather to Ukraine. What is it? The British Navy has more admirals than it has ships. It has more generals than it has operable tanks. These are the kind of, France is a little bit better off, but really not much. So anyway, yeah, they don't have it. They can send a token force that can get obliterated. What is that? And they just might. Again, it just seems like, I guess you have to say this for them. They seem to be aware, that they are aware to some extent of their weakness on some level, because they have asked again and again for a security guarantee from the U.S. You say, U.S., please, serve as our backstop. We'll go in there, but you'll be our backstop. So in other words, they're admitting that they can't do anything, that they can just be tripwire forces. And the hope against hope that, they'll draw the Americans in if they do suffer an attack by the Russians. So there is a bit of realism. I'm sure their defense departments the defense departments in Europe are telling their respective governments, hey, we just don't have many people. I'm sorry, we really can't do this.
Do you think the delusional behavior we're seeing from France and Britain has something to do with their martial history? I mean, if you go back in the past, England was that the British Empire was where the sun never set, right? They ruled the world at one point in time. And France had the Napoleonic era where, they ruled Europe. Is there some of that you think that is sort of deep set in people like Starmer and Macron? And that's one of the reasons that they just can't accept the fact that we're not as great as, our history tells us we are?
Yeah, I think there's no question about it. It's just that they, especially the Brits have taken the fall of their empire badly. And what they've done to really compensate for that is to ally themselves closely with the U.S. And they just, through their association with the U.S., they can, as they say, punch above their weight. They can pretend to be more powerful than they actually are. So, when the U.S. went to Iraq, the Brits sent in people in Iraq, same thing in Afghanistan and so forth. So they can, through their association with the U.S., and present themselves as still a major player in the world, one of the great powers. But now we see, when now that the U.S. seems to be intent on pulling out, it's just like the British lapdog is just a lapdog, that's, but they're not taking it very well. Yeah, there's some sort of, we're getting a lot of Churchillian rhetoric from Starmer. He's pretending that, okay, now is the time for Britain to perform its historic role, and yet we're hearing the same kind of thing, echoes of Napoleon in France. I think that there's a lot to be said for that. But it's so far from the reality, though, that in the end, it's just going to be comical. It may end up, it's comedy now. It may end up a tragedy. I don't know.
Has the U.S. really severed? How severely have the ties between Europe and the U.S. have been severed? Are they? Has Europe lost the U.S. or are they in the process of losing it? Like, what's going on?
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's just the same thing. It's just, again, with Trump, it's really, and his administration, clearly, again, the Trump administration has landed some heavy rhetorical blows. I think probably the best example of that was J.D. Vance's speech, and which left the organizer of the Munich Security Conference in tears, crying about the death of the rules-based international order. So, yeah, there is a sense, because of these very strong statements that have come from the Trump administration, that, the alliance is in real peril. It's coming to an end. But nothing, outside of, again, like the U.S.'s, association with certain NGOs and, not just NGOs, but actually, in some cases NGOs, but also agencies. There hasn't been any institutional change, let's put it that way. NATO's still there. It's still got the same budget. Nothing has changed. again, I think recently Trump suggested that the U.S. commander would cease to lead NATO, which would be a first. That's never happened before. It's actually General Cavoli, is an American, is now basically the commander in chief of NATO, the most important person. We talk about the general secretary all the time, but it's really, it's really the military commander who has the real power, and that's General Cavoli. So they've talked about Trump has talked about actually ending that arrangement and letting the Europeans actually choose somebody, which is going to be a problem again, because we may see the rise of, intra-European rivalries, because I'm sure the Brits, the French, the Germans, they'll all want to have their guy in there. We'll see what happens. So but that's still at the stage of talk. There hasn't been, aside from certain agencies like recently Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe was basically shut down. And that was something that was done in close association. They're American. These are American agencies, but they're done in close association with the Europeans. So the Europeans are talking about actually taking over. Like maybe the European Commission will take over Radio Free Liberty, or Radio Free Europe rather. So yeah, we have seen some changes, but it's really very minor. Who knows? I just have. It's not like none of this matters. I mean, just the fact that it's being said, it's really let the Europeans understand that, that these certainties, or what were certainties in the past, are no longer certainties. I think they have probably good reason to hope that in the end, not so much will change in this term. And then who knows, especially if there's an economic recession here, the Democrats will come back in power and set things right. But in the end, even if that does happen, it's just like the old certainties are still gone. There's a fear that, who knows, next term might be J.D. Vance, and he might really carry through on it. That guy's, actually scarier than Trump. He's less talk, but he's more walk. So yeah, we haven't seen the changes, but I think there's no doubt, but the transatlantic relationship has already suffered some severe blows and is going to be weakened. We'll see to what extent. It's still unclear, but it has been weakened.
Do you think it's only the elites that are really afraid of losing the Americans, that in general the people of Europe aren't that concerned, or they maybe feel liberated? Because really the institutions like NATO and the EU, these rely more on the United States, because you talk about this collective action problem. And if the U.S. isn't there, then all of a sudden they're freaking out. And who's going to lead NATO? Who's going to tell the EU what to do? Who's going to direct their foreign policy? We don't know. Mm-hmm. But if you just look at it historically, I mean, prior to NATO and the EU, Europe did great. I mean, that's where Western civilization was born. They didn't have to have a centralized authority dictating them how to think, what to do, and they were able to make up their own minds and make their own agreements between each other. Of course, we had some nasty wars,
right.
But
yeah.
So yeah. What do you think? Or is it just elites that are afraid of that? Is there real fear? Having that power vacuum, is it dangerous? I mean,
yeah. I think you're right. I can't speak authoritatively about this. I haven't. Well, but I have seen polls, and it suggests that, again, the elites are much more committed to this, committed to Ukraine and committed to NATO than the average person is. I think you have a lot of people who simply trust the elites, but if the elites are overthrown, they'll just put their trust in the new elites. I think that's true in Europe. I think you're right. It is basically an elite phenomenon. It's not something that springs up from the grassroots. It's the people that staff, the bureaucracies in Brussels. They're the ones who are gnashing their teeth and wringing their hands now and making all these threats. I don't think it has much popular support. Certainly not in Western Europe. Maybe maybe in some of the Eastern European countries, especially the Baltics, you might have some real popular support for these kind of programs. But yeah, so I think that's true. And then, just about the history of Europe, I know that I think that's one of the justifications, of course, for the creation of the European Union and the increasing centralization. Say we've had these terrible wars in the past, and this is a way to avert the war, through centralization. Now, of course, it's actually the centralized authority that is maybe going to is putting Europe in danger of a bigger war, with Russia. I don't think that'll happen, but it's less likely now anyway than it was in the past. But the solution, also entails risk. The solution of centralization. Okay, but let's say that there is maybe a greater risk of war when you have all these states, powerful states coexisting. But I know that it's been argued, I think rather quite convincingly, that one of the reasons for the success, really the magnificent, extraordinary achievements of Europe was this diversity, the competition between different states. It did fuel creativity. And then, there's also national pride that can motivate people to do great things, to do horrible things, but also great things. So, the French take pride in France, the Germans take pride in Germany, and that motivation, that dedication to one's own people, one's own culture is real. But as I said earlier, I don't think anybody's really, inspired by the European Commission. Right? It's a bland bureaucracy that doesn't have any of that sort of. It doesn't inspire the kind of devotion and that national governments can. I think in the end it's sort of a dead weight. That's my feeling. It's just something that theoretically, you can make arguments for existence, but it just doesn't have. It's not a life and living organism the way that a national state can be, for better or worse.
So, do you think that the EU and NATO have to be dismantled for Europe to really thrive again and find its own identity and carve its own path in the world?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I don't feel like I can really speak for the Europeans, but I think, certainly the EU as it exists now, it's become a bureaucracy that's really divorced from the people, and that has been completely brainwashed by the neocons. Has become a proponent of this global hegemony. That was. Even when the U.S. was fully backing them and they were united with the U.S., that was still really unrealistic. Now it's becoming a joke. I think this has to go. I think there is a place for some, let's say, pan-European organizations, areas of cooperation, and maybe that can mitigate, reduce the possibility of war and reduce tensions. But I think the bureaucracy that they created in Brussels is a monster, and it has to go.
Okay. Well, do you think it will go anytime soon?
Not anytime. Well, I don't know. It's just like things have changed so rapidly in the last few years that I think it's a mistake to say, it can't happen. A lot of things I expected were like 20 years off, and they have happened. We've seen a lot of changes. Even if they're not, they're just partial changes, like we're talking about the transatlantic relationship. It's still there, but it's taken a beating in a way that I think few of us could really imagine just even a few months ago. And so I don't know, if this continues, maybe at the end of Trump's term, it'll, NATO will be gone, or it'll just be gutted, and maybe it'll have a European general in charge of it, and it'll be just something entirely different, maybe. And then again, it's hard to say with Trump. There's often a lot of talk and bluster and not necessarily action that follows it. We'll see.
Right. What I find kind of odd is that 10 years ago, there were a lot of countries talking about potentially moving out of the EU. I mean, we had Brexit, but there's also talks about like Finland even leaving it. I think there were some other countries. It was a topic of discussion.
Yeah.
Countries in Europe were considering this as a potential, option for them. And now when Europe's in such a crisis right now, you think this is where you would start to see a lot more countries talking about leaving the European Union and saying like, hey, we're not happy with the way you're governing things. We're not happy with the direction you're taking with regards to the Ukraine conflict. We want out. But I'm not hearing talk about, any countries exiting the EU anymore, which I find strange, especially with countries like Hungary, which have just been denied like the right to engage in any sort of semblance of a democratic process within the EU, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I know that at least the EC is making moves to deprive them of veto power. And yeah, they've deprived them of funding and so on and so forth. I think Orban would like to leave the EU, but there is, at least in the near term, there's going to be a very large economic cost. I think they are subsidized and they get a lot of trade advantages and so on and so forth. So it's hard to give up all those things right away. It may not be politically possible, and I think that's what other countries are looking at. It's true. I think in France there used to be a much greater anti-EU sentiment, and Marine Le Pen was openly, let's say, at least very skeptical of the EU. I don't know if she proposed that France should exit, but there was, she clearly had her doubts about the EU and she voiced them. But since then, it retreated. There have been votes, maybe it was in France actually, where countries have voted to exit or at least reduce their cooperation with the European Commission. And essentially, games were played. The EU didn't like the outcome, so the vote was held again later, and the movement died. So there has been a real effort. Let's say, yeah, there was a lot of open skepticism and hostility to the EU that you're not hearing now, but I think it's partly a result of really elite efforts to suppress those voices and to and to tie these countries even closer to the central authority in Brussels. But I don't think that skepticism and that hostility is gone. It's there, and you hear it voiced by the AfD leaders and other parties within Europe that are out of power. But so there is this potential for future exits, and if a major power actually exits the EU, Germany is considered to be really the kind of the foundation of the EU. So if Germany should leave the EU, it's probably over. What we can see there's clearly a fear too on the part of the elites that these movements will start to gain traction, these anti-EU movements, and I think that explains the cancellation of Georgescu's candidacy, because he was such an open skeptic of the EU and of NATO. And there was some talk, he was putting together a fascist party, and this was supposed to be part of the reason. I think it's clear that that's not what they were really afraid of. It wasn't some comments he had made in the past, but it was his anti-EU, anti-NATO stance, because they just banned another political party. It was another candidate, a woman who they had banned earlier, and I guess they banned her again, and it made it clear that she couldn't take part in the presidential elections. And there's no talk about fascism or quasi-fascism or anything like that. They just said explicitly that she could not run because of her anti-EU and anti-NATO positions. So, that's,
Really?
yeah. So that, shows there is, the elites are afraid of it, and they're fighting a dirty war against it. And that's maybe the reason that we're not hearing so much of it, but I think it's always there. And as things get worse, it used to be that, again, the EU was the golden club, it was the club of the prosperous nations. So all of these other countries didn't want anything more than just to be part of the EU. That they saw that as their ticket to prosperity. But as and they didn't really see any alternatives. But now we have rising alternatives. We have the BRICS. So we have Hungary and Serbia, which is not part of the EU, by the way. Looking eastward now and looking to the BRICS and seeking normalization of ties with, or strengthening of ties with Russia. And then you see Russia strengthening economically, and Europe in the economic doldrums, if not in outright recession. It may be that the luster of the EU is starting to dim, and then over time, it just won't have that pull anymore. I think, like at the center of it, it was this association between prosperity and Europe, and if Europe actually ceases to be prosperous, if Europe is seen clearly to have lost the war that they committed themselves to, the EU just may find itself mortally wounded. We'll see. We're not there yet, but that could be in the not so distant future.
Okay, yeah, that was going to be my question. If when Russia wins this war, when it's all over, would that be kind of a crushing blow to the European Union? Do you think that's possible? That could be an outcome, and that might be one of the reasons why the EU is so dead set on continuing this war, because they know if they lose, that all of a sudden how they're going to explain to their constituents, all the elites in power that paraded this war and promoted it and told the people that this is existential crisis, that if we don't do this, then Russia's going to just roll over into Poland and into France and into Germany. So we got to gear up now. And then once this war is over, it's all done. Russia isn't advancing through the rest of Europe. Relations are normalizing and gas starts to flow. And they're like, what was this all about? Mm-hmm. We just wasted hundreds of billions of dollars and we, exhausted a million lives, Ukrainian lives, for what? For nothing. You lied to us. Mm-hmm. And then that would just be the end of the EU?
It could be. Yeah. I mean, I think there's no question that it would be, first of all, a psychological blow. These people are emotionally invested in the Ukraine project, in Project Ukraine. If it's clearly failing, but they're just in a state of denial. But then if when the Russian victory, is just is too obvious, and that their world, this fantasy world that they've constructed around themselves, will come crashing down. And I don't know how they're going to behave. I mean, what are these people going to do? The Macrons and the Starmers and so on. I'm not sure. Or they just will get thrown out of office. I think there's just going to have to be a price to pay for this, because, yeah, they made their people sacrifice for Project Ukraine. I mean, their economies are suffering. It's not, there's direct economic aid to Ukraine. That's part of it. And then there's all the weapons, the billions and billions of dollars of munitions that they've sent to Ukraine. And then there's probably the greatest cost of all is the lack of cheap energy. And all of these have made Europeans significantly poorer than they otherwise would be. And their elites have been trying to hide this from them, but I think they can't hide it forever. So there are going to be repercussions. I don't know what, because again, it's sort of like when you're talking about, I don't know what these elites are going to do. It's almost like talking about mental patients. You can't really predict their behaviors, but I think there's clearly going to be anger and a kind of a throw the bums out sentiment among the populations, and that we'll see new governments come to power, and hopefully these governments will be much more reasonable.
Well, what's the situation right now on the battlefront? Well, actually, before you tell us that, do you believe that kind of what we've been talking about a bit is making me feel like that there's the likelihood of reaching a negotiated settlement? It's by no means guaranteed. That maybe this is just going to have to be settled on the battlefield. Yeah. Is that what you feel? That this is just going to be settled militarily?
I believe so. I really, the thing is, it's not just that Ukraine is so far apart from Russia, but it seems to me that the Americans are too, that they really haven't kind of recognized the concessions that they have to make, unless there's something going on that we can't see, but just from the public statements. We hear these very optimistic statements, but, we'll have a complete ceasefire in 2 weeks. We hear this from Trump and from Witkoff, and they just seem absurdly optimistic. And I don't see what they could possibly be based on. I think that the two sides, even the Russian and the U.S. sides, are very far apart. And I don't think we're going to see a negotiated settlement. And then the Russians, again, have every reason to drive a very hard bargain. They have made compromises in the past. They have signed agreements, and they've been burned again and again. The most famous example is Minsk, where, again, there were 4 parties to that agreement. I think it has to be remembered. There were the Russians, the Ukrainians, the French, and the Germans. And 3 of those leaders of 3 of those 4 parties, Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, and Poroshenko. So anyway, the Ukrainian, French, and German leaders all subsequently said, we just pulled the wool over the Russians' eyes. We were, again, this is not just an interpretation. They went out and said it. Angela Merkel said it twice. The others may have said it more than once too. But they made public announcements where they stated that directly. It was just a way to buy time. We never really wanted to implement it, and they didn't. And there was really frustration over at Minsk that led to this war. That was, Putin actually went against the wishes of the Donbass people. They wanted to be part of Russia. But he said, no, we're not going to, let's try to work something out so you can still be part of Ukraine. And there were a lot of people within Russia that felt like he was being very naive. And they've been proven right, we have to admit. And that's what Putin himself has admitted. So after that experience, and there have been other agreements, we can go into a lot of them, but we won't do that now. The Russians have, I think, become much more realistic. You can say cynical, but it's a cynicism that's based on reality, on past experience. And I think they're going to drive a very hard bargain. And I think, which the other side will not be able to accept. And I think, too, that, that they really, whether it's definitely the Ukrainians, the Ukrainians are crazy. We see them already. They just attacked that metering station immediately after saying that they had agreed to a ceasefire. But the Americans too. It's say, well, maybe Trump is really serious about this and he would stick to an agreement. But what happens, 4 years from now? It could very, very possibly be, a new kind of a Biden administration, but headed by somebody who's more mentally aware and vigorous, but with the same foreign policy goals. Those people aren't gone. And they would just, the Americans have torn up a lot of agreements with the Russians. So I think the Russians, they'll negotiate, and hopefully, but I think they understand that they just have to, in the end, the only permanent peace is going to be achieved on the battlefield. They're going to have to destroy the Ukrainian army and take these territories, and that's all for real. Any agreement that they make, maybe it'll be helpful, but maybe it won't. There's just no solidity to these agreements between Russia and the West. So I think that, I think the Russians understand that. Anyway, from my point of view, and I think a lot of other analysts are saying that it really would be a mistake for the Russians to put much faith in any kind of agreement that they reach with the West.
Right. And a big problem that we've talked about before is that the U.S. is entering into these peace talks as if it was a mediator between Ukraine and Russia, when it's clear that we are the belligerent. We're more than the belligerent. We are the cause of this war. And I think that is maybe one of the largest obstacles to peace as well, is the fact that I think it's necessary for the U.S. to admit culpability in the Ukraine war in order to achieve peace. Like, can we just say, without ever admitting our part, the fact that we're still funding them and sending them military arms, but the NATO expansion, just everything that we've talked about, this is largely the fault of the United States. This was the U.S. dream to destroy Russia, to maintain Western hegemony, to maintain the unipolar moment. And if we don't admit that, like, hey, yeah, we were kind of at fault for this, then do you think that's a big obstacle to peace?
Yeah, well, I think it is. I mean, it's just sort of it would be hard for the any administration to do that. But there are ways you can do it. Maybe it would fall short of total honesty, but it would be a step in the right direction. You could say, just emphasize that, and this would be largely correct, not entirely, but largely correct. This is the fault of the Biden administration. They really blew it. And you get some statements from that, but they're kind of contradictory from Trump. Yeah, he did mention that, yeah, it was provoked by NATO expansion. But then he's also like, if I were there, I would be so tough. So it's all about the same old, like he would have flooded even more arms into Ukraine. And he, actually under his first term, a lot of arms were sent into Ukraine as part of the problem. So, yeah, it's going to be hard for Trump to be fully honest. I think for any leader, it's not just Trump to be fully honest about it. It's hard to, actually to step down from that pedestal of being the world hegemon and being the shining hill on this, shining city on the hill and all that. And, the American exceptionalism is not going to die overnight, but you could, I think it is important to admit fault, or you have to, in the end, to really change the narrative and to address the real causes of this war. I don't see how you can address them without revisiting some of the earlier actions by the American government.
Well, yeah, I'm starting to lean that way as well. A month ago, I was feeling pretty optimistic about a negotiated peace settlement. Now I'm kind of thinking maybe this will just be settled on the battlefield as well. And also just the fact that it might be quicker to be on, that like can you tell us what's currently going on the battlefield now? I mean, after this Kursk pocket collapse, or are they moving to Sumy? What's happening in the Donbass? Yeah.
Right. Well, in Kursk, things seem to have maybe stabilized is the wrong word. But, after that very rapid collapse that began, it began before the special operations through the gas pipeline. But it really was accelerated by that special operation. And the Ukrainians were driven out almost entirely out of Kursk, and now they just hold on to a sliver of land. It's basically 2.5 hamlets right there on the border. But that hasn't changed, and I don't know if it's because the Russians have decided to just take a breather and consolidate, and and kind of to actually just firm up their logistical lines, to make sure that they're ready for the next stage. I don't know if it's a decision that was made on the Russian side, or if it's because, as many reports have stated, the Ukrainians have sent many reinforcements to the area, it seems ridiculous just to hold on to this tiny sliver of land, but it just allows Zelensky to say that he still holds pre-2014 Russian territory, that he still holds on to a little tiny piece of Kursk, and I think that's very important to him. But at some point, I think because we're talking about just a little bit of land in the very near future, either those reinforcements will simply be destroyed. Maybe it'll take a couple of weeks, I don't know, and the Russians will continue to advance. And again, Putin has said that he wants to create a buffer zone in Sumy, so they're going to continue. They're going to cross the border as they've done on the flanks already, and strike deeper into Sumy, and gain control over a piece of Sumy at least. There may be the intention to take all of Sumy somewhere down the road, because it is largely it is a Russian-speaking territory. So that's what's happening or not happening in the Sumy Kursk region. And then along the rest of the line, there was a couple of weeks ago, the Ukrainians launched some counterattacks, and they had some success. And this happens again, like every couple of months. At some point, the Ukrainians will concentrate forces at some point along the front line and launch a counterattack. Quite often, the attack is repulsed immediately. It fails entirely, but sometimes they do take back a village or part of a village. In this case, they did take at least one village south of Pokrovsk, and then they also went back into Toretsk and took took control over some buildings and city blocks. And now my understanding is that those gains by the Ukrainians have been almost entirely reversed at this point, which I think was inevitable. But those parts, the Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, Pokrovsk, seemed not much is happening there. We saw a lot of movement there, in the preceding months, but the Russian advance has slowed there, and it seems to pretty much, for the time being, come to a halt. But this is what we see often. It's just like one part of the line. I think it's just, I don't know if it's in general the Russian strategy, or the broader strategy, I believe, is that they exert pressure along the entire front line, and then when they notice a weakness somewhere, they exploit it and push forward there. And then the Ukrainians are forced to send the reserves there, and then that weakens another part of the line, and then the Russians push forward there. It seems like the Ukrainians have tried to have sent the reinforcements to Pokrovsk and the Toretsk area and Chasiv Yar. But the Russians are finding it much easier to advance farther north. So you don't hear about it much in the news, but over the last couple of months, they have taken a lot of land north of Kupiansk, up in the Kharkov region. They cross the Oskol River, and they keep on expanding. First, they said it was a bridgehead. It's a lot more than a bridgehead now, and they are seem to be making a pretty big move there. So there's talk that may be as part of a planned attack on Kupiansk, which again is a city in the Kharkov region. But it also might be something larger. It may be that they're going to, the Russians had that incursion into Kharkov that they launched about a year ago, and they might start driving from that, the piece of territory they took there in the northern part of Kharkov, and then now they're going to come up from the south, from the Kupiansk area, and just take everything there in eastern Kharkov. Again, there's discussion of that. We'll see. It's very hard to predict what the Russians are going to do. But then, they're advancing in the Liman area, which is just south of Kupiansk. And then there have been some pretty significant advances south of, in the Zaporozhye region, heading towards Zaporozhye city. And for a long time, I know military analysts have been looking at that as a possible area for a major Russian offensive, because they do have a lot of reserves in that area. They could put in like a good 150,000 soldiers. I've heard talk about possible major Russian offenses ever since the beginning of this conflict 3 years ago, and it never seems to happen. They seem to just continue. Right. So
it's like the Russians don't seem to do major offenses. It's something that we like to think about, the big punch right through the line. But they play the slow game, just let's attrit. Let's slowly attrit Ukraine. We minimize our casualties. Our military base keeps on building and growing. Theirs keeps on going down. Why change? And I think,
you're right. And I think it'll happen at some point, but it'll happen when the Russians think that the Ukrainians have been sufficiently weakened so that they can do these major offensives and grab large, amounts of territory. Instead of, advancing a kilometer in a day, they can advance 10, 20 kilometers in a day and without suffering significant casualties. And they may just feel like the Ukrainians still, they have clearly been weakened, severely weakened, but not to the extent that the Russians can carry out one of these offensives and do it without suffering significant casualties. The those big offensives, yeah, um, that they can achieve, great successes, they grab large amounts of territory, but they're always costly. Yeah, you always lose a lot of men when you do that because they have to get out in the open and they become vulnerable. It's a lot safer if you stay in your carefully constructed, trenches and bunkers and just pound away at the enemy. And then when you've kind of basically pulverized the enemy in front of you, then you move in, when you're sure that there's going to be very little resistance. That's what the Russians have been doing. And they've been making steady advances. And I think really with minimal losses over the last several months. And I think that's going to be the plan. But who knows? There will be that point where I believe, where they make the decision. Now is the time, and maybe that's not too far in the future. Maybe it will be after this Rasputitsa, the mud season ends. It'll be another month or so, but who knows? It could be a year from now. Just because I do always hear about impending offensives, and they never happen. The Russians have stuck with this policy of just pressure all along the front line and just always, pushing forward when there's a weak point. And it's been successful. It's, again, it's just they're in a much stronger position now. They pretty much started that, you could say, a little bit over a year ago. It was a year ago that they took, a year and a month ago that they took Avdiivka. And they have had a lot of successes since then. And maybe we're just going to see more of the same this year. But then, there's that talk of the collapse. We saw a collapse on a small scale in Kursk. I think that was fair to call that a collapse. That was, it was just crumbled. The Ukrainian defenses crumbled and they fled in great numbers. And maybe that's just a foretaste of what we're going to see on a much larger scale. I think it is. It's just a question of when. That's just really hard to say. It's the when is the most difficult thing to predict.
Yeah, well, when it does happen, it'll be interesting to see how the EU and the US react to this. It's where the rubber meets the road. Or there's going to be panic amongst all the nation's capitals across Western Europe. They're going to try to send in troops. We'll see.
Right, and again, like I've said, let me just say
go ahead
quickly. It will be a test for the Trump administration. It's just that, I think it's clear they want to get they just like to be finished with this, get out of this conflict. They don't want to be involved in Ukraine, but it is going to be hard for them to leave, if especially when, as I said before, when the Russian army is marching on Kiev or something. I mean, there's just going to be the din of protest and the howls of outrage are going to be hard to ignore. And it's going to be, and Trump, I think, has a real fear of ever being compared to Biden and what happened in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And they're going to try to blame it on him and say it was weakness and so on. And we'll see. Maybe he'll be able to blow it off. It's very hard to predict Trump, but he might be vulnerable to those kind of criticisms. And he might feel like he's got to go back in, or just the fear of that will keep him from actually pulling out.
That's a scary thought.
Yeah.
I hope not. Okay, well, Dad, I want to cover a little bit in the Middle East. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling fine, yeah.
All right, throw you a couple more questions.
Sure.
Okay, so Trump issued a letter to the Ayatollah in Iran and basically gave him an ultimatum. Said you have 2 months to make a new nuclear deal. Or else what? I mean, I'm not sure. We're going to bomb Iran, go to war with Iran. I mean, what do you make of this letter, this ultimatum that he issued?
Well, it's very disturbing, and it's frankly, it is, I think, really foolish. I mean, it shows the foolishness of Trump's earlier decision to pull out of the JCPOA. What was that? The joint plan of action. I'm forgetting what the C was. But anyway, the JCPOA, which is agreement between several countries to strictly monitor and limit the Iranian nuclear program. It is a nuclear power program. All these accusations that they're trying to develop a bomb, we've been hearing them for like 25, even 30. I think you go back to the 1990s in the case of Israel, and there's just never been any real evidence. There's a claim that something was found back in 2003 or whatever. I think that's doubtful that was actually the true evidence. I think it was probably fabricated by the Mossad. But even if you say that, okay, anything since 2003, and that's our own intelligence committee, that was their finding. That they have not been committed, involved in trying to develop a nuclear weapon. The Iranians haven't been. So anyway, but they did agree to this JCPOA, and it subjected their nuclear power program to very strict monitoring and controls, very, very strict. But Obama did it. It was his achievement. And then when Trump came in, it was one of the first things he did was to rip up that agreement. And I think partly because it was Obama's agreement. That's the kind of thing Trump does. And also as, he's paying back his Zionist supporters. So yeah, he tore that up. That it took years to actually make that agreement, to get all the parties to agree to it. The U.S. never, even under Obama, really abided by it. They were supposed to lift sanctions. They didn't. So from the start, the Americans were sabotaging it, and then Trump just tore it up. Now he's telling him, okay, you got to come. We've got to have a deal within 2 months, or else. And the implication is that there's going to be a military attack. But how the Ayatollah Khamenei has said that we cannot deal with these people, and I think he's right. I mean, it's just like the history. Why should they? Again, it's similar to what the Russians have experienced, but even worse for the Iranians. Why should they? It took years to do this. You never abided by it. Then you tore it up. And now you're telling us that we got to do this in 2 months. Why should we believe you?
So you think there's no way that the Iranians are going to play ball with this?
Yeah, the only possibility is, this is something that Alexander McClure has mentioned, is that there was, I think the Americans actually asked the Russians to mediate. I think it's just like maybe to approach the Iranians, basically. And maybe it's just like the Russians might say, hey, at least like pretend to play ball or something. One thing, the situation is different now. We've got your back. We've signed this agreement with you. We're going to provide you with military and economic support. Your ties with China are a lot closer, than they used to be. But we've got a very unstable person in office, in the presidential office. It's actually, or somebody who's making threats. In fact, but of course, you go way back to George W. Bush and earlier administrations. There always have been threats of attacks on Iran. But maybe just to, we've started this agreement. We're going to work on building up your defenses. Maybe we can do something, engage with them at some level. Maybe the Russians can encourage and say, don't worry, we're not going to pressure you to go into anything you don't want to do. But perhaps it's just best to at least talk to them and make some gestures. And then in the meantime, we can work to build up our defenses. That's a possible response to it. At the same time, I mean, the anger is such, and the cynicism is such within Iran that they just may not even want to, this is what they've said. Again, Khamenei is the supreme leader. He says, we're not even talking to them. And that just may remain firm. Where does that put, if the Iranians don't talk, then where does that put the U.S.? Okay, well, Trump has made a big threat. He sent his ultimatum. What's he going to do? They've already imposed new sanctions on them, but it's just like they've already sanctioned Iran to the gills. And it's just like, as in the case, it did damage them a lot. And, it still is harmful to their economy, but they're better off than they were a few years ago, again, because of these connections with the BRICS countries. It's just not the same state of affairs. So, I mean, the sanctions just don't have the bite that they used to. And I don't know if there are many more sanctions that can be imposed on them. So, what can Trump do, other than a military attack, where we talked about, how difficult that's going to be and how potentially disastrous that could be for the U.S. So it may be that, again, as we've seen with Trump, there's a lot of bluster and then there might not be any action to follow it up. But it's a risky situation because it's not just Trump in this case. There are a lot of people, as we talked about, within that they've always been there in the U.S. government, in the Defense Department, in the State Department, who really are itching for a war with Iran. Fortunately, there's also been the people, the realists, that have always pushed us back from the edge of the abyss. But it's disturbing. It's just like, okay, we'll say the pro-abyss people and the anti-abyss people. Okay, so far the anti-abyss people have won, but it just takes one victory by the pro-abyss people for us to fall into the abyss. That means to actually engage in a real war with Iran, with the disastrous consequences that we know. So that danger, that risk, it never goes away. And now, it's coming to the fore again. We'll see. Maybe we've averted these crises in the past. Maybe we will again, but it's very, very worrying.
Do you feel like the situation in the Middle East is worse now than it was under Biden, during the whole time under Biden, sir?
Well, I don't know if it's any worse, to be honest. Okay, a lot of the things that Trump is doing are things that Biden did. He just didn't do it with as much bluster. And I think that's the main difference. Again, Biden really went after the Yemenis, the Ansar Allah, and Trump saying, you didn't do anything, but he did. I mean, they fired all the missiles they had on those ships, and those ships had to go back to port to reload. It's one thing is that I guess that the kind of missiles that they fire cannot be loaded at sea. You have to go back to a port. Now, this is one of the problems. And in Ansar Allah, the Houthis are aware of this. So, we're hearing about this tremendous bombing campaign, but they're eventually going to empty the chambers of their guns, so to speak, right? And they won't be able to fire any more bullets. And they're going to have to go back to port, just like Biden did. So again, Biden, it wasn't like it was just sort of a perfunctory effort. He really went after them. And now Trump's doing the same. Maybe he's going after them with greater intensity. But in the end, he's going to run out of bullets too. So yeah, there's not a big change to report with respect to Yemen. And then, the genocide was ongoing under Biden, ever since October 7th, right up to the end of his reign. It was ongoing. And it was actually the ceasefire was largely due to Trump. Now that ceasefire has been torn up. And with Trump's blessing, let's be honest. He says there were reports back then that he had reassured Netanyahu that after the first phase, if you want to go back in, I'll back you. And that just seems to be true. He's going back in, and Trump's saying, we completely support you. So yeah, it's been torn up again, but we're back to where we were basically, right? In Gaza, unfortunately, tragically, it's really awful what's happening there. And then, yeah, with regard to Iran, I mean, there was, I think, believable reports that the Biden administration, which is to say Blinken and Jake Sullivan, were considering very, quite seriously about attacking Iran right towards the end of Biden's term, and they chose not to do it. So yeah, we came close under Biden, and now we're going to come close under Trump. So far, I think again the differences are more rhetorical than not. We'll see. Substantively, we're seeing a continuation of the policy in the Middle East.
If we can't stop the Houthis, what makes us think that we can take on Iran?
Yeah, Oh, it's a very good point. The I think that the Houthi technology is largely derived from Iran. I don't know the extent to which, like, the Iranians are directly supplying them with weapons. What I've heard is that the Iranians showed them how to make these weapons, and the Houthis have actually, have modified them for their own purposes. It's Iranian-based technology, but there is a Houthi input, which I find quite extraordinary. It just shows, again, the poorest country in the Arab world, one of the poorest countries in the world, can actually develop these weapons and threaten the world's most powerful navy, actually render it impotent. The Navy has not been able to carry out its mission of protecting shipping in the Red Sea. They failed. Prosperity Guardian failed. And it failed, and the defeat was brought about by, these very, very poor people in the hills of Yemen. I mean, it's really amazing.
It is. I just think about the world's most powerful navy in the world is getting thwarted, defeated by a country that doesn't even have a navy. They don't even have a navy. It's incredible. And
yeah. Right. So anyway, if you just take Yemen and multiply it by 10,000, and that's Iran. Iran is a large, prosperous country with a lot of, very talented engineers, and they have developed clearly very successful military technologies, and they have been preparing for a conflict with the U.S. for, at least 20, 25 years.
It's unbelievable to think that we might actually get into a war with Iran. It's going to be a huge wake-up call for Americans mostly, but a lot of the world. I mean, I think a lot of the world has slowly woken up to the illusion of U.S. military might, thanks to the Ukraine conflict, and also thanks to the Houthis over the past year. But this war is just not going to go the way that the supporters of it think it's going to go. And it's kind of hard for me to understand how they can't see that, because we've had a lot of evidence of just this past year of what our capabilities are, and just this idea that we could take on Iran. One, they also have a defense contract with Russia, right, and they're very closely allied economically, at least, with China. This is absolute insanity. If Trump does this, that will be his legacy. That he will completely sink it. And it just, I guess the thing we can say with Trump, I was asking if it was more dangerous under Biden or Trump. I mean, with Trump, the thing is, things move a lot quicker, so it's just like things can change, and it's hard to know where it's going to go. But the way he's talking with Iran, if he does this, we're talking about the global economy will crash. The Strait of Hormuz will get shut down, oil disruptions, U.S. aircraft carriers sunk to the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah.
Don't play with this, man. This is not. I hope we don't go down this road.
Yeah.
It's so amazing that we're even considering it. It's like, okay, sir, you have two options. One will be endless suffering and pain and death, and the other one is just a nice path full of ice cream and lollipops and sunshine. Which one do you want to take? It seems to be that clear, these two options on choosing a conflict with Iran, and we're actually thinking, we'll go down the endless suffering path.
Yeah. Well,
madness.
Another thing to point out, another consequence of a war with Iran could be relations between the U.S. and Russia. I mean, it would clearly have severe consequences for that relationship. It would put it under a lot of strain, because Russia is not going to abandon its commitment to Iran. And that's going to anger the Americans, especially as they get into a war with them. But it's also going to anger the Russians, seeing their close, not an ally of some kind. They don't have a mutual defense pact, but they're, it's a country that they have developed very close military and economic relations with. To see them come under attack by the U.S., it's going to make it quite difficult for those negotiations to proceed.
For sure. Okay, well, any parting words, Dad? Anything else?
No.
Okay, I think we covered a lot today, so I think we
Yeah.
can call it.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, and have a good rest of your day and a great weekend.
You too.
All right. Bye bye.
Bye.
Guys, thanks for listening. Please like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And if you haven't checked it out yet, please check out my website, nobliski.io. You can look at the pinned comment below. It's something that I think you'll find useful. Even my dad uses it. My wife uses it. Instead of Googling things, you should be using this website because you get access to OpenAI, Perplexity, Anthropic, DeepSeek. There's hundreds of models that you can use. It's what I use to create the thumbnail images, things like this. And the greatest thing about it is there's no rate limits. There are no subscription fees. It's free to try out and use. You get free tokens every day. So if you're not a heavy AI user, you will never have to pay for anything. But this is really my passion project. I really want to get it off the ground, and I think you guys would like it. So yeah, check it out. Let me know what you think. And if you have time to download the apps and give it 5 stars, that'd mean a lot to me as well. Thanks a lot.